We've got an exciting show today. I want to remind everyone that the interview will go until 1:30, and then there'll be a 15-minute interactive Q&A period for listeners. Just type your questions and comments into the chat box as they occur to you, and Sarah will queue them up for the interactive period. Now to our guest. Before there was Keith Ferrazzi, for me at least, there was Heidi Roizen. It was about 10 years ago. I was a cub reporter for Inc. magazine, and I'd read a Malcolm Gladwell article bringing to light the power of social capital as a resource, and specifically those rare types who achieve mastery of it. Gladwell called these people connectors. He wrote that their skill was so distinct and valuable that they literally ran the world, and finally he hypothesized that connectors were born that way. I decided to test that hypothesis. The research was spare then and overly theoretical, except for one Harvard Business Review case study on a woman named Heidi. One of the few female power players in Silicon Valley at the time. She had started and sold a successful tech company, became an executive at Apple, and then a venture capitalist. She called both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs friends and was known to have one of the deepest, most extensive networks in the Valley. She was undoubtedly what Gladwell called a connector. And unlike anything else I found, the case study laid out in fairly plain language some strategies and guidelines for how she does what she does, convincing me that there was indeed an operating system for social capital mastery. And like all systems, there was a code, a set of rules, and those could be taught. But I couldn't get in touch with Heidi at the time. Soon after, Keith got in touch with me, and the rest is history. Now, to make amends for that, Heidi, it's great to finally talk. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's go back to that case study. To this day, it's still taught, now along with Never Alone, in most MBA programs. You still get a few MBAs emailing you each month.
I do.
But I saw that when you first read it, your reaction was, this is boring. It's just common sense. This is what people do. Why did you think that?
Well, I think that's part of the issue and part of the trick of figuring out. And I will admit, I kind of don't like the word networking. I think it's building a social framework, or it's something else, because networking to me has always implied this: you go and you get something out of somebody else, right? Or you're specifically going to create a tie. Where I look at it more that you are going out there in the world to find other people with whom you can mutually improve each other's lives in one way or another. So I just kind of see it as a very different thing. And I think part of my issue with the case is when they approached me about the case and they said they wanted to do something about building a network, and I sat for the interview and then I read the case, I thought to myself, well, gee, this is all sort of common sense. This is, half of the stuff in the case is, this is what you learn in kindergarten. It was my opinion. But it turns out that common sense is not all that common, and that it is helpful to some people, particularly people starting out in their careers, if you can, so to speak, deconstruct the process of building this social framework for yourself and put up some basic rules, that it is helpful to people to review those rules and to put them into effect.
So to this day, you still don't think that there was this underlying and unique structure and process to how you navigated the professional world?
Well, no. I mean, I think the problem is you get thrown out in the world, and particularly, I've always been a relatively social person, so I think that is one of the things, although, having taught the case many times, I've been approached by people who say, I'm just not that social, what do I do? And I do think there are strategies for people who aren't naturally gregarious. But I think 30 years into doing it, someone can sit down and write a case on you, and they can go back and extract sort of what the principles are. But I can't say that I woke up one day at 23 years old running a software company saying, oh, my God, I better go out and build a social framework because that's going to matter. It just seemed like the right thing to do. It was a young industry, and everybody was moving at a very rapid pace. There weren't very many people in the industry. So, frankly, I think one of the opportunities I had, one of the advantages, is simply new, and it wasn't that hard to break in because there wasn't that much to break into.
Well, you tell me, you have taught it over the years, this study, and you've expanded and elaborated on the structure and the process. And presumably you learned and refined how other people learn from what you've done and did.
Definitely.
So what are the big ahas and takeaways for people? What lessons, both general ideas and concrete strategies, have proven over the years to deliver the most value and create the most change for other people?
I think that, first of all, just being given some guidelines and being told that you don't have to be a natural, that everyone can develop these things, gives people some belief in their ability to go out and do things. And I'm a big believer in, the first step is you got to believe you can go make a change and you can make something happen. I think the idea also that everyone has something to give. What do you possibly have to give to someone else? And by the way, the fundamental approach for me, if you want to boil this case down to one thing to take away, it's don't approach someone because you want something from them. Approach someone because you have something to offer. Now, there's no reason that offer can't be a win-win for you as well, but think in terms of what value are you bringing to other people, because ultimately that's why they're going to continue to connect with you and they're going to answer your phone calls and your emails and your whatever, is because they see you as someone who can be helpful to them. And I think that's a very easy thing to learn, right? And that's a very easy thing to test and check as you go out and prosecute your life, is when you go out and intend to form a relationship with someone, the first thing you should think is, what value am I to them?
Well, I'm gonna push you a little bit later on the interview on the idea of this simplicity and that everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten. Okay. Just because I think that maybe depreciates the idea of social capital versus these other forms of capital, and how there are really sophisticated means to manage and organize and accumulate it like any other form of capital, and especially in this era when we start understanding the dynamics of networks, how they operate.
Absolutely. And there are tools and tricks and things that one can do to build and maintain a social network, obviously, that are available to us today that weren't available to us in the past.
So before I get to that, it's another question I'm thinking about, but I want to get to some of the nitty-gritty stuff that you've talked about over and over again. And the first is credibility. We defined, we're using social capital. Let's define it. It's the information, expertise, trust, and total value that exists in the relationships you have and the social networks to which you belong. Now, to gain access to that capital, to those people and communities, you've made the point, and we do as well, that you need credibility. By the time you were a VC, this wasn't an issue, but it was in 1985 when you're a 25-year-old woman, a creative writing major, launching a software company in, let's be honest, a notoriously sexist industry. Yeah. How did you establish credibility then?
Well, I think that credibility, especially in Silicon Valley, there's a large element of meritocracy here, and the idea that you are credible if you set out to do something and you accomplish what you set out to do. And so starting a software company, I started it with my brother, who is a brilliant programmer, but I, being the English major and MBA, I was the everything but the code person. And it turns out everything but the code is kind of valuable to do as well, and I was the CEO. So I think part of credibility is getting out there, staking a claim in the market, saying you're going to produce a product, producing the product, handling the customers, doing what you need to do. And I think whenever I ran into a situation where someone was not receptive to me because I was young or I was a woman or I was non-technical or for whatever reason, my feeling was there was always someone else I could go to. There was always another door I could open. And as many times as being a woman hurt me, it probably helped me. It probably made me stand out. I know, for example, in the early days of the Valley, there were so few women to write articles about that I knew I would get more than my fair share of press given the size of my company because people were looking for women to write about. So there's an example of, I wouldn't call that exploitive, I would just call that a way that it might have helped me. On the flip side, there were certainly times I would walk into a room or a situation where I did not feel particularly welcome. I don't think beating your head against those walls is a very effective approach, and I think I learned pretty quickly I think, tenacity and a good sense of self-worth and a sense that you're going to accomplish something even in the face of difficulty, those are all things you need to build in yourself and need to build with your small group. Everybody starts out with a group. I mean, even if it's your mom, right? At least you got somebody who tells you you're good and they like you. You need to get some strength from those people and recognize that not everything's going to be a win, and if you don't find the win, you need to move on and go somewhere else.
Well, I thought a particularly helpful insight that I've seen you make with credibility is the importance of context. And you have to be valuable for something, or you don't accumulate social capital. You've said you build a relationship in the context of working on something with someone. Explain that in terms of your own career.
Yes, and I will tell you as a funny side point, when I go and teach the case, and cases are always sort of a two-dimensional version of a reality intended to teach something. The funny reaction I get is people say to me, "Wow, you're like a real person and you have friends," and because the case is sort of created to say that everything I do is with this intent of building this network, and if you don't have value to me, I'm not going to be your friend. And I don't know, it comes out a little harsher than the reality. I mean, I think the reality is, we all have our personal and our social circles, and I wouldn't necessarily say that those are built on these same ideas as going out and building a business network. So, I hope it is not perceived that way. But I do think there is something truthful in any relationship you build is, what are you bringing to the table for that other person? What is the context of the relationship? What can you offer? And everyone has something to offer. And I think this is the thing that particularly people starting out don't realize, that maybe, for example, let's take a situation where you want to get to know someone in your community who runs a company. Well, maybe you can't do something directly for them, but maybe they're involved in a charitable organization, and you can go volunteer at that charitable organization, and you can work the desk, and you can help with membership, or you can go do something. And eventually, as I find in many charitable organizations, it's pretty easy to work your way up the ranks if you devote some time and energy to doing it, and eventually you will end up in a circle with that person or have an opportunity to talk to that person. So now that might be a very methodical way to get to one person. I don't know if that's necessarily a great thing to do, but it is a tactic. I mean, I think, again, think about, what do I have to give? What can I do to create value with that person? What can we work on together? And it isn't always, your relationships are not always built in the business context. They may be built in a community context, in a context related to other social activities.
Well, I thought it was interesting. I mean, that context creates intent, and not only for the other person, but in your own mind. And you tell a story about being at your first company before you started your own at Tandem, where you were the editor of the company newspaper, which gave you a reason and a context and access to meet anyone in the company. And what made me, what kind of light went off is that as a journalist, one of the things you learn, no matter how socially awkward you are, is that you have that context just by virtue of being a journalist to approach anyone at any time, and it emboldens you. And I think,
to stretch it a little farther, I personally believe you have a context because you're a human being to approach anybody else. So I don't think that this is an interesting thought to have, is you could probably find a connection with every other person on the planet if you probed enough about what your interests and your beliefs and your style and your passions and, what music you like or what TV shows you like or what do you like to do with your time. I mean, there's probably a connection point because we're all very complex beings. I mean, I think it is a little easier when you can construct something, and I do think, having just said that, I don't like when people email me and they say, it's like, will you be my pen pal? Will you please mentor me? Mentor you what? Usually that just means, will you look at my resume and help me find a job in the Valley? But, which is okay. I don't mind that. But I think it's easier to have a context, and that approachability and that comfort level for you. One of the things I've done in my career, and I think it's been very effective, and it's been very enjoyable too, is I've always gotten involved in the trade associations in the industries that I'm in. So I became part of the Software Publishers Association when it was very young, and I ended up, getting on the board and ultimately was elected president. I was on the National Venture Capital Association board. I got elected to that board. I worked my way up the ranks and ultimately was elected chairman of that. You can find places, and I think this is particularly useful when you're a little bit of the little fish in the big pond. If you go work on the trade association or something else, you will make contacts and you will have an opportunity to connect with people and speak with people that maybe in your sort of regular professional life you wouldn't have the opportunity to do that. So that's another good way to gain access to people that you may not normally have access to.
Yeah, that speaks to another important idea that I've seen you stress about the importance of doing your homework. And it comes up specifically in your most recent venture, which is a company called Skinny Songs, where you create music that motivates people to lose weight, which, by the way, you've lost what now, over 35 pounds?
Yep.
Wow. That's amazing. I'm sure people are going to check this out, to check Skinny Songs out after the call. But this was an entirely new industry, a new field for you, new people, new networks. I want you to talk about, how, as you were approaching it, how did you do the homework? What homework, did you spend time figuring out what new relationships you needed to create? And then once you identified them, did you figure out how you were going to create them? Talk a little bit about the process.
Absolutely. And what I'll tell you right now is I'd give myself about a B on this one, simply from the perspective of this. I did a really good job at connecting and finding the right people and finding people who could really help me create the product. I did not do as good a job thinking through distribution and how music is discovered and all of those things. I was really about the product and the product creation, and it's interesting that, here I am, a relatively old dog. I've been through product creation before, but up until now it's always been in the same industry, and I kind of grew up in that industry and understood that industry. And the big mistake I made was not necessarily understanding this industry. And so I will honestly admit that my focus was more on the creation of the product than on the distribution and marketing of the product. So I did some things well in the distribution and marketing, and certainly I think people would say I did a good job of generating publicity for the product. But that, again, was very similar to what I used to do in the software industry. And, in fact, many of the same people, the same journalists who would find it an interesting human interest story. The creative process, even though it was a different group of people, right, music people as opposed to software people, I found them very similar. And I found that, understanding how to work with creative people, how to give them the general gist of what you were trying to accomplish, but give them a lot of free rein in how they accomplished it, how to find connections through people. And interestingly, there are a lot of connections between the technology world and the music industry. I think some of those creative brain cells are, they work on the same thing. And a lot of people in the computer industry are closet musicians. So I used some of the typical tools. I contacted my friends who were interested in music. I knew Thomas Dolby, who is, at least for people in my generation and a little younger, kind of a big rock star, and he's a friend. And he's also in the technology industry. So I talked to Thomas about what would he do, how would he approach finding artists, because I was passionate about this. I am only the songwriter. I am not a musician. You would not want to hear me sing, trust me. And when I wrote when I did the songwriting, I'm only the lyricist. When I would try the songwriting, everything sounded like, oh, my darling Clementine. So I was definitely not the person, and I knew I was not the person to do the work. And, and then a lot of the same skills applied. It was finding the right people, thoroughly researching them online, finding connections through other people, going in with a very credible, passionate pitch about who I was and what I was willing to do for this, finding some like-minded people. It took a little convincing, particularly David Malloy in Nashville, who's kind of one of the big music producers in Nashville, to explain why, as he put it, he was going to make music for fat chicks with a venture capitalist, and he didn't even know what a venture capitalist was. And I turned him around, so by the end of the project, he said it was one of the most fun projects he had ever worked on, and he was really proud of the music. And in part because I'm not a musician, and so therefore I would say to him, this is what I'm trying to accomplish with music. This is what I'm trying to accomplish through lyrics, but you're the expert in creating music, so I'll back off, and and you are the arbiter of the music, right, and the creator of the music.
Mm-hmm. Hearing you describe that situation in which one of your relationships that you were trying to connect with describes your project as music for fat chicks, makes me think of something that a point about being fearless that you make, and you express it through a joke that you say that your dad told about a guy praying to God every day, and
right.
The guy says, "Please let me win the lottery, please let me win the lottery," and one day God's voice booms down and says, "Work with me, buddy, buy a ticket."
Yep.
And the fact that you would just try to kind of mow down that guy and get him to agree, it probably is a theme within your life and within the social capital realm.
Right.
How important is that in kind of your relationship to social risk and your ability to overcome that in your own mind, do you think, for yourself, but also for the people who you teach?
Well, I think you have to have a certain amount of tenacity and belief in yourself and what you're trying to accomplish, because sometimes it takes a while to get other people on the same page with you. Sometimes they're never going to get on the same page. And I think there's a fine line between appropriate persistence and just beating a dead horse and becoming an annoying presence to another person. And I think, again, if you continue to approach this and say, what's in it for them? My belief of what was in it for David and for George Daly, the other great producer I worked with for both of them, was doing something new and unique, having creative license, having upside in the deal. I was funding the deal myself, right? So I was not asking for them to contribute financially, although I was also not paying them, tons of money to do it, and doing something that would have a positive impact on people. Now, if I hadn't gotten David to ultimately go from thinking music for fat chicks to this is actually going to change people's lives, he probably wouldn't have done the project. So I do think you have to have a sense of self and a sense of response and be very aware of the feedback loop, right? When you approach someone, there are clear no's, right? And then there are people who are a little skeptical but maybe need to be convinced, and maybe you need to do a little more homework. I think one of the interesting things about the example with David is he was not personally going to ever relate to this music, right? He's a dude. It really, most of my audience is women. But he took the lyrics home to his wife, and his wife said, this is what women think about all the time. And that plus the quality, I like to say, the quality of the lyrics and the fun of the lyrics. It was a song called Skinny Jeans, and he really got a kick out of the song. And then when his wife said, I really think this could work, that's when he came back and was more positive. So sometimes, it's a process to build relationships and to get people on the same page with you. And I think recognizing sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, this is another thing that I think we talk about in Silicon Valley a lot, which is you have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to fail. If you don't risk and you don't occasionally fail, then you aren't risking enough. And so that's a good thing to remember, because when you come home and somebody just shut the door in your face or told you they were not interested or your product was stupid or something, remember that doing the kind of things that entrepreneurs do requires that once in a while you actually have someone shut the door in your face. And this is actually a part of the road that you're on. And so don't take it so personally.
Well, speaking of being assertive and your relationship to risk and kind of the need for a certain aggressiveness, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the intersection of networking, relationships, business, and women. You mentioned yesterday, and I did some extensive reading about a Columbia University business school professor named Frank Flynn, who used your case study and experiment on his students. He taught a case to his entire class, but for half of them he changed the name from Heidi to Howard. Talk about that case and what were the results.
So it was a fascinating study, and I didn't know about it until it was already conducted. And in fact, I only found out about it because my nephew was a Columbia student, and Professor Flynn said, "Gee, your last name is Roizen. Do you know Heidi Roizen?" And my nephew said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, I ran an interesting study on her a couple semesters back." And that's how I found out about it in the first place. As you said, he just changed the name from Heidi to Howard and then ran the case the same way. And then he asked two groups of students to take a brief survey. Did they want to work with Heidi or Howard? Did they think the person was would be fun to work with? Did they think that the person was ethical? And interestingly, Howard scored better than Heidi. I mean, that's the punchline number one. Number two, the discriminating was done by the men in the class, not the women. And number three, Heidi and Howard were judged equally effective, but not equally likable. And
well, yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating, right? And this was conducted, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. This was not done in 1976. You know, this is done with relatively current MBA students at a top business school.
Heidi, you've got to, like, especially obviously for the women, you know, coming up, you've got to reconcile how, on the one hand, you just said, you know, you've got to adopt this entrepreneurial mindset, you know, risk failure, be aggressive, and here we learn for you know, modern day MBA students, that the more aggressive the woman was, the more they hated her.
That's right.
And we had a Stanford professor, Jeffrey Pfeffer, on our last podcast, who laid out the data showing that success and likability are positively correlated for men and negatively correlated for women. So how do women get around this?
You know, it's a fine line. That's the thing I would say. There are circumstances in which it is appropriate to be a little more aggressive, and there are circumstances in which it is appropriate to be a little bit more friendly. And I will admit, I tend to gravitate towards people that I can do business with that I would also like as friends. And it's probably not surprising that many of my close friends are also people I've done business with in the past. And, you know, one of the attitudes I've at least taken at work, and I try to follow it, is even if you're going to be aggressive, you should always be respectful. And there are certainly some extremely famous people in the Valley who are known for an aggressive style that I would say borders on disrespect. And there are a number of people like that, and it obviously works for those people because they're famous people. I mean, not only famous, they're successful. They've done a good job. That doesn't work for me. I don't like being the person booming around the room, throwing expletives at everyone and all of that. That's just not my style. And so I was personally a little surprised because I think of myself as a reasonably likable person. And I think, again, this is a little bit part of the issue of the case being a two-dimensional version with a specific goal in mind versus a person that you get to know. And in fact, if I ever teach the case live, people say to me afterwards, "You're a lot nicer than we thought you were going to be," which again always surprises me. But oh well. You know, I guess it goes back to this: is luckily not all men are bad, right? Luckily not all women are bad. And if you find someone who is not supportive of you, if you are a woman and you're out there and you have a boss who, for example, seems to not give you as much leeway or opportunity, it's up to you to go find another boss. I mean, I'm not a huge believer in complaining and getting somewhere by complaining. I'm a huge believer in finding the place in which you are a better fit.
You know, let me throw something at you about that. I found that Flynn had actually followed up on that experiment to see how students rated their own peers. And he found that when raters didn't really know the classmate they were rating, they rated more assertive men as more hireable than assertive women. So basically the same result as your case study experiment. But in another experiment, when students were more familiar with the person they were rating, the bias vanished. So maybe this is why you didn't experience the bias, and that the answer is a little more nuanced than don't be aggressive, or is that you always made sure all the right people were familiar with you, and maybe the right people were the people that you liked and you could do business with, but kind of acknowledging the bias never meant you became a wallflower. You still.
Well, I guess the other thing I would say to you is, can you think of a single strong relationship you have that started out with aggression, other than maybe sports? I mean, it's very hard to say, gee, I'm really good friends with that person now, and we got to know each other because he sued me, or because he fired me. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't personally really think of one. I can think of maybe one or two in my whole social network where the initial introduction was aggressive. And I would say in the two cases I can think of, A, the person is really aggressive, and B, there was sort of a basis of misunderstanding that led to that aggression. Maybe that's just my way of rephrasing it, but so I just think any relationship you're building, do you really or people, right? Whether they're people you're doing business with or people who are watching your kids or people, in whatever direction, your kids, your parents, they're people first and foremost. And people don't tend to like to be around people who are abusive and aggressive and all of that. Now, that said, it takes a certain amount of, and I go back to the word tenacity, to get the job done. And I think that you can be, I think aggressive is a negative word. I think tenacious is a more positive word for the same thing, which is I need to get something done, and I need you to help me get this thing done. And I want you to understand why it's important for us to both get it done. I want to figure out what your needs are. And in business school, I learned this great thing in negotiation class, which is negotiation is the process of finding the maximal intersection of mutual need. And I love that idea, right? Negotiation isn't a negative thing. Get zero-sum game. It's both benefit the most from whatever it is we're trying to accomplish together. So I don't think of it as aggression, but I do think sometimes you have to make hard decisions. I mean, anyone who's been a CEO or been in a role where they have people reporting them ups and downs of a company, sometimes you have to terminate people. Sometimes you do it because, hey, they're good people, but you can't afford them anymore. Sometimes you have to do it because the person is not a fit for the role. Does that make you, a bitch if you do it? Or does that just make you a good business person who actually also believes, as I do, that sometimes the best thing you can do for a person is release them from a role in which they're guaranteed to be unsuccessful because they're not a good fit?
Very well answered, Heidi. Unfortunately, we are already or a little over the 1:30 mark, so I'm going to start kind of pulling in, or Sarah's going to feed me some questions from listeners. One of the first ones we have is, can you offer advice for someone who had built a great network but has switched industries and is now struggling to grow a new network?
Well, as I said, I think the switching industries thing is difficult. I think that I certainly, as I said, I didn't give myself a great grade for switching. I would say that when in doubt, start small. Find a few people with whom you maybe have multiple connections. One of the best ways to gain access, to build a network is to leverage someone else's network. And so finding a few people who are both like-minded with you and well-connected in that industry is probably worth a little extra of your time. And that might sound a little manipulative. I don't want to, again, I like to approach everything saying, okay, I'm gonna go out and find people with whom I can make a real connection and where I can really add value to their lives. But if you're going to do that in a new industry, you may as well pick someone who's been in the industry for a while and who is central to that industry.
This is a good one. In this, one of the participants asked any tips for people who work remotely and need to build relationships from a distance.
Well, I have two tips for that. One is make use of technology, right? And even what we're doing today, there's a big difference between hearing someone's voice and seeing them in video or Skype or whatever. So I use those sorts of things a lot. That's a little better for maintaining a relationship once you've initiated it. It's a little hard to just go, start a Skype relationship with somebody. I think make use of blogs, follow other people's blogs, make use of all the social tools, LinkedIn, what have you, that are available to you. But I also think that there is a certain value to some amount of face-to-face contact. It's a reason why when you're on a public company board, you are required to show up in person for most of the meetings, right? Not just be on the phone, because there's a different level of engagement. And I have taught, for example, entrepreneurship both here at Stanford as well as overseas at the University of Edinburgh. And what I figured out at the end of my semester at Edinburgh is I told all those students, if you're really serious about starting a tech company, get on an airplane once in a while, come to California and attend a conference or do something where you can form some face-to-face connections. You don't have to live here to do it, but I think you do have to show up once in a while, because there is no digital remote proxy for being able to run into someone and share a cocktail or share a cup of coffee or share a joke and or even sitting next to someone at a conference, right? I've met some really interesting people just because I happen to be sitting next to them at a conference. So get on air.
And yet, Heidi, you've written that 90% of your interactions are on email. So is there something that you're doing over email that other people don't in helping to facilitate and establish these relationships? Is there a certain kind of style that you like to adhere to?
Well, I think I use email extensively. I use databases of my networks extensively. I try to be very responsive, even if the answer is a no. I think, as I learned from 8 years of being a venture capitalist, I think people prefer a fast no to a never-ending maybe that never goes anywhere. I try to be very explicit about what I will and won't do for people and why, and try to do it in a nice but clear manner. I also try to be a little proactive about outreaching when I read somebody just shipped their product, or somebody just got a promotion, or somebody just had a baby. A little word of a little attaboy goes a long way, I think, in maintaining the relationship. And people like to know that you're thinking about them and you noticed when something happens to them, good or bad. I mean, if someone experiences a death in their family, sending them a card, actually a handwritten card, is a really nice thing to do. It's a human gesture, and again, people appreciate that. And I don't do it because I'm trying to manipulate those people. I do it because I think it's the right thing to do as a person who cares about other people. But I think that those things help. I think having a little bit of a sense of humor, one of the things I do, and I know it's been pointed out, is I have this annual newsletter that's kind of funny, that my goal is to actually make it funny. I don't write about, what grades the kids got, or in fact, my kids once said to me when they were little, how come the other newsletters talk about how great the kids are and how they got A's and how they were number one on their basketball team, and you highlight the dumbest things we say each year? Well, write your own newsletters, kids. But it's because I felt like part of the fun of doing something like that, particularly if I send it to a wide audience, is that it has to be kind of funny, right? That you have to sort of have some humor in how you present your life. And I think that's, again, that is trying to keep a personal connection with other people, even people I may not see for a whole year. At least I know I'm doing that one thing where they can have a little slice of kind of the, the personal side of my life in a fun way.
Apropos of that, I mean, I send out a newsletter, but it's also clever in that it's a very highly leveraged kind of way to reach out to your entire network. Are there other, and I'm sure you get this a lot, and I ask it a lot without getting necessarily a great answer, which is, are there other, what is your system for organizing, your relationship database? There was another question someone asked about, what kind of software do you use, or what kind of information do you store? Do you have any kind of novel answers to that, or?
I'm not, huge. It's not like I have a huge sophisticated thing. I don't record every transaction I have with a person. I use LinkedIn. I use Facebook. More to find people than really to engage in deep conversations with them. I don't belong to a lot of groups. I just found it was kind of overwhelming to be in a lot of groups. I use email extensively. I use the Mac suite of, address and mail and all that kind of stuff. I'm an email person. That is my style. And my kids say that's old-fashioned, but, that's okay. I don't tweet. I don't follow tweets. Okay, I'm kind of old world that way. But I found it just too much information and not the filter wasn't very, very good on that. And I text with a very small group of people, the people that I don't mind interrupting me anytime, day or night. So that's, pretty small group of people. I think it's more, I don't know, I think it's like muscles you build, right, that you learn over time. For example, one of the things I learned early in my career is it was important to learn how to remember people's names. So I use go look it up on the internet. You can find hints for how you remember people's names. And over time, you do that enough, and it becomes a pattern. I've, over time, built a calendar that's got everybody's birthdays in it. Of course, that's easier now because Facebook does that too. And it's somebody's birthday, I know that I can send them a note and say, happy birthday. I mean, it's tools like that, right? Nothing that I use, I don't have any super highly sophisticated tool that I use. It's just the accumulation of all of this stuff over a long period of time.
Another question is, what has been the best, most original way someone has ever approached you, and what did they offer?
Ooh, that's a good one. I had a business school student, a couple business school students have been very creative. One of them offered, when I was on my weight loss thing, he was a personal trainer, and he said he would train me for free if I would talk to him, if he could ask me questions while he was training me. Somebody offered to babysit for me once. That was pretty good. Let me think. Another one offered to cook dinner. I'm not kidding. I mean, they were fun, and I think again, it's if the person approaches it in a fun way. I think that's really good. One of the things I do, and I recommend this to people kind of at the other side of the food chain, the people who've already built a big network but still want to be open and, pay it forward, is I take an hour walk every day, and I populate that hour with a person. And they don't have to have a lot of qualifications to be that person, in my book. A lot of times if someone will approach me and say, I'm a student or I'm starting a company, and, I will admit I particularly focus on young women entrepreneurs, but I say to them, great, I'm willing to spend an hour with you if you're willing to come to my house and walk with me and my dog. And I figure what's the worst that happens out of that is at least I get some exercise. So I think figuring out a way to blend an activity that's good for someone else, if you don't see any immediate benefit for yourself. And remember, not everything do you see an immediate benefit. Sometimes, I think this is an important point, I know we're almost at the end here, you don't always know what the benefit's going to be. Do you ever meet a person and you just think, this is a cool person, and this is an interesting person, and I don't have anything I want from them right now, but I think my life would be better off if I knew this person and if I was helpful to this person. And I'll tell you, I've had that attitude, and every once in a while, that person ends up doing something really cool or really neat, and even if all the answer is they call me and they say, 5 years ago you said X, and I did X, and it was really important that you said that, and I want to thank you. I mean, that's a huge karmic benefit. I feel good about that. So sometimes you don't always know why, what it is you expect, and sometimes the payoff can be a long time out, 10 or 20 years. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, and that's building a base of relationships is, at the end of the day, what does your gut tell you about the opportunity you're going to have to enhance that other person's life and the opportunity they're going to have to enhance your life?
So Heidi, we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left. I have one final question I've been thinking about. In doing the research for this conversation, I saw that your former VC colleague, Brad Feld, wrote an interesting blog post in which he said he'd been too promiscuous with his social networking habits. And he had no clear rules about who to accept as friends on Facebook or LinkedIn, so he'd accepted everyone. And now he realized that those networks had become useless. And it points to an idea that social capital isn't an ever-expanding asset where bigger is always better. It also parallels the conversation we've been having internally about whether relationship building is a zero-sum game or not. In other words, does sharing your network with others, introducing one contact to another, always help?
No, and I think you have to be very disciplined about when you can and when it can't. And so, for example, I know you pointed out, I'm friends with Bill Gates. I don't forward anything. Anything that anyone sends me says, please forward this to Bill Gates, I don't do it. I don't do it because part of my friendship, Bill, everyone forwards things to Bill. And so one of my rules was, is I didn't want to be the person who was forwarding things to him. And I don't even forward him things that I care about my own charitable activities, right? So I just decided that in that relationship, which is a highly unusual relationship, I was going to set some boundaries because too many people ask when it's inappropriate. I have people who send me resumes saying, I see there's an opening at this and that company, will you send a resume? Well, if I think they're a good fit, I'll send it. If I don't think they're a good fit, sometimes I'll say, I know what they're looking for and I don't think you're a good fit. Now, more often than not, I just send it because what's the harm in that? But for example, in giving personal references, I've turned down people who ask me to serve as a reference for them because I'll say, look, I didn't have enough work context with you to be able to provide a credible reference, right? And so I'm not going to do it just because you're asking me. I think you have to learn how to say no. And I think the social network thing, I have 4,300 friends on Facebook, right? So I have clearly let Facebook get out of hand, and LinkedIn the same way, which is why if you go on my Facebook page, you will basically never see me post personal information. I mean, I know, and even what's personal, well, you can go on and see who my children are, and they post lots of personal stuff. So, there's a risk that you take. But I just don't use those in the same way that some people are using them, and I look forward to things. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens between Facebook and Google Plus with circles, and how do you solve this problem of, honestly, when I go on Facebook, do I want to see the latest information from 4,300 people? No, I want to see it from my kids, my best friends. I mean, and again, I think that the tools will become more sophisticated for managing that.
Oh, there's so much more to that. And I wish I had time, but that will do it. Our time is up. Heidi, it's been better late than never. You're amazing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry you didn't find me the first time, but I'm glad we finally got to connect.
And on behalf of all of us, myGreenlight, I want to express our gratitude for taking the time to teach and share with us from really an exceptional life and career that you've created for yourself. So everyone who's watching or listening to us, thank you all. I'm looking forward to your feedback. You can all connect with me on Twitter at TallRoz or on LinkedIn. Let me know everything from who else you wanted to interview to questions you want to ask. Also, to see all that Heidi's up to, check out her site at www.heidi.roizen.com. Thanks again, Heidi, and until next time, keep connecting. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks much. Bye-bye.